How could you afford the dress?
The invitation was a joke. Amara knew it the moment she pulled the ivory envelope from beneath her apartment door and saw the gold-embossed crest of the Han estate pressed into the wax seal. She'd cleaned that estate every Saturday for 14 months. She knew which bathrooms smelled like expensive cologne and which hallways held the kind of silence that made your spine straighten without being told. She knew the address by heart. She knew the family by reputation. And she knew Seo Han. She turned the envelope over slowly, standing in her doorway in her cleaning uniform, the faint smell of bleach still on her wrists. The card inside was thick, the kind of cardstock that cost more per sheet than Amara made in a day. The script was delicate, gold, precise. You are cordially invited to the annual Han Estate Charity Gala. Saturday, 9 p.m. Black tie. At the bottom, in Seo-yeon's unmistakable looping hand, a single line had been added in ink. Do come, Amara, wear something nice. Amara read it twice. Then she set it on her kitchen counter and made herself a cup of tea and stared at the wall for a long time. She wasn't stupid. She'd never been stupid. That was the one thing circumstance hadn't been able to take from her, not her mother's death when she was 19, not the scholarship that fell through, not the 4 years spent rebuilding herself in a country that barely saw her. She cleaned houses to survive. She did it with precision and pride, and she did not confuse the people she worked for with people who respected her. Seo Han had never spoken to her directly, not once in 14 months. She issued instructions through a household manager named Mrs. Park, who delivered them in the clipped, careful tone of someone translating between two species. Amara had watched Seo glide past her in the corridors, silk robes, perfect posture, eyes that moved through Amara the way light moves through glass. Not malicious, simply absent. This invitation was not kindness. Amara understood immediately what it was. She'd heard the other household staff talking in the back kitchen, the way they always did when they thought no one important was listening. The gala was the event of the season. Every powerful family in the city would be there. Seo had apparently made a bet with her closest friends that she could invite anyone and dress it up as charity. A performance of magnanimity, an act so condescending it dressed itself in the language of generosity. Do come, Amara, wear something nice. Wear something nice. As if the joke was already written, the punchline already assumed. The help showing up to the party, the awkward moment in the receiving line, the looks, the whispers, Seo-yeon's practiced expression of gracious surprise. Amara drank her tea. She thought about declining. She nearly did. Then she thought about the woman she used to be before she learned to make herself small in other people's rooms. She thought about her mother, who had walked into every space she entered like she'd been invited by God himself. She thought about 14 months of invisibility. She set down the cup. She accepted. What Seo Han did not know, what no one in that circle knew, was that Amara's aunt had died 3 months ago and left her something. Not much, by any standard. A small amount in savings, a piece of land back home that hadn't sold yet, and one dress. The dress had belonged to a woman named Celestine Aucaffer, Amara's great-aunt, who had been the mistress of a French fashion house director in the 1980s and had lived, for 12 years, a life that defied every expectation placed on her by accident of birth. When Celestine died, the dress passed to Amara's mother. When her mother died, it sat in a garment bag in the back of a storage unit in Hackney for 11 years. Amara had never opened the bag. She hadn't been ready. She was ready now. The dress was black, floor-length, a construction so precise it felt less like clothing and more like architecture, the kind of garment that understood the body moving inside it and chose, deliberately, to make that body unforgettable. It had been valued, years ago, by a private auction house. The certificate was folded inside the garment bag. $3 million. Not because of diamonds or gold thread. Because of who made it and when and for whom, and because some things carry history in their fabric the way bones carry memory. It was irreplaceable. It was hers. Amara hung it on the back of her door that night and looked at it for a long time. Saturday arrived the way inevitability always does, quietly, without ceremony. She did her own hair. She borrowed nothing. She took a taxi to the estate she had cleaned every week for over a year, and she stood outside the gates for exactly 30 seconds, breathing the cold night air, watching the valets move in their practiced choreography, watching the limousines exhale their occupants onto the stone steps. The security guard at the outer perimeter checked her invitation without looking at her face. Then he looked at her face. Then he looked at the dress. He stepped aside without a word. Amara walked through the gates of the Han estate, not through the service entrance, not around the back, not with a mop and a key card, but through the front, her spine straight, her mother's ghost walking quietly beside her. She didn't know yet that he would be there. She didn't know that Han Jaiwan, head of the Han family, had returned from Busan 3 days early. She didn't know that he had never, in 38 years, attended the gala his wife organized every year. She didn't know why he'd come back. She was about to find out. The ballroom was designed to make people feel small. Amara had cleaned it a dozen times, had moved between the tables on her hands and knees, checking chair legs for scuff marks, had polished the marble floors until they reflected the chandelier above like still water. She knew every corner of this room. She had been invisible in every corner of this room. She was not invisible tonight. She felt it the moment she crossed the threshold, not the dramatic silence of films where music stops and heads turn in unison. It was subtler than that, and worse. A shift in the room's atmosphere, the way conversations continued but eyes moved, the way champagne flutes paused halfway to mouths, the way attention, carefully trained to appear disinterested, swiveled toward her with the precision of a compass finding north. Amara kept walking. She had practiced this, not the walking she had always known how to walk. She had practiced the stillness inside the walking, the part where you feel 100 eyes and you let them look and you give them nothing in return. Her mother had taught her that. Let them stare, baby. Staring is just looking with your mouth open. She took a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and found a position near the far edge of the room where she could see everything without being cornered. Old habit. 14 months of moving through this house had taught her its geography in a way none of these guests would ever understand. She knew where the exits were. She knew which walls were load-bearing. She knew that the east corridor flooded when it rained, and that the third chandelier from the entrance had a bulb that flickered when the heating system engaged. She knew this house. These people did not know her. She spotted Seo-yeon across the ballroom within 30 seconds. The woman was luminous in ivory silk, surrounded by her usual constellation, 3 women whose names Amara had never learned, and whose faces she recognized from the gossip columns Mrs. Park occasionally left on the kitchen counter. They were laughing at something. One of them glanced toward the entrance with the particular expression of someone waiting for a punchline. Then Seo-yeon turned. Their eyes met across the length of the ballroom. Amara watched it happen in real time, the recognition, the confusion, the rapid recalculation. Seo-yeon's smile didn't fall. It was too practiced for that. But something behind her eyes shifted, rearranged itself, tried to make sense of what it was seeing. The maid. The dress. The way Amara was standing in the middle of her ballroom like she had always been exactly here. Seo-yeon leaned toward the woman beside her and said something quietly. The woman looked. Her expression went carefully neutral, which told Amara everything. She turned away from them both and looked toward the gardens instead. The conversations that reached her over the next 20 minutes were not subtle. She heard asterisk, who is she twice. She heard, I don't recognize her once. She heard asterisk, that dress in a tone that sounded like hunger, which was the most honest thing anyone said all evening. A woman in red paused beside her under the pretense of admiring the garden view and introduced herself as Mrs. Choi, wife of some executive whose name meant nothing to Amara, and spent 4 minutes trying to determine Amara's net worth through increasingly creative conversational detours before giving up with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Amara answered every question politely and gave nothing away. She was good at that too. She was midway through a conversation with an older French gentleman who had worked, genuinely and with great enthusiasm, as a textile conservator for 30 years, and who recognized the dress immediately with the reverence of someone encountering a religious artifact. Celestine Ackhafer, yes. I read about this piece. I never thought I would see it, when she felt something change in the room. Not toward her this time. Away from her, toward the entrance. The shift was different from when she had arrived. That had been curiosity, the room bending toward something unfamiliar. This was something older and more instinctive. The room didn't just look, it adjusted. Postures straightened without conscious decision. Voices dropped half a register. The energy contracted the way it does when something apex enters a space, and every other creature in that space processes the information before the mind catches up. Amara turned slowly. Han Jaiwon stood at the top of the entrance steps. She recognized him from the framed photographs in the estate's private study, a room she cleaned monthly, carefully, without touching anything on the desk. The photographs showed a younger man in formal settings, the kind of images that communicated power through composition rather than expression. They hadn't prepared her for the reality of him. He was taller than the photographs suggested. He wore a dark suit with the ease of someone who did not dress to impress anyone in this room. No pocket square, no visible jewelry, nothing that announced itself. He stood at the top of those steps and surveyed the ballroom with the unhurried patience of a man who had never needed to rush a single moment in his life, because the moment would wait for him. His face was still. Not cold. Stillness and coldness were different things, and Amara had learned the difference young. His face held the particular calm of someone who sees everything and has already decided what most of it is worth. She watched him scan the room. She watched him stop. For a fraction of a second, less than a breath, his gaze found hers across the crowded ballroom and did not move on the way everyone else's gaze had. It didn't assess. It didn't perform. It simply landed and held with the quiet certainty of someone who has located exactly what they were looking for without knowing they were looking. Then Mrs. Park appeared at his elbow and said something, and he turned away. Amara exhaled slowly. Beside her, the textile conservator was still speaking about Celestine's legacy. She hadn't heard a word in 30 seconds. Si-Hyo-yeon found her at 9:47 p.m. Amara knew the time because she had just checked her watch, a small, inexpensive thing on her left wrist that looked like a splinter against the dress surrounding it, and which she had deliberately not replaced because some contrasts told the truth better than any words could. She was standing near the garden doors, the cold night air threading through the gap she'd left open, when she heard the heels. She recognized them, low, precise, deliberate, the walk of a woman who had decided something. Si-Hyo-yeon stopped beside her and looked out at the garden for a moment, as though they were two acquaintances sharing a quiet view. Up close, the ivory silk was even more immaculate. Her perfume was something expensive and floral and entirely without warmth. "You actually came," Si-Hyo-yeon said. "You invited me," Amara replied. The silence between those two sentences was its own conversation. Si-Hyo-yeon turned to look at her then, really look, for the first time in 14 months. Amara held the look without expression. She had nothing to perform and nothing to hide, and that combination, she had learned, unnerved people who were accustomed to having an effect. "The dress is remarkable," Si-Hyo-yeon said finally. Her tone was the careful, calibrated one people use when they are trying to locate an angle and haven't found it yet. "Where did you get it?" "It belonged to my family." "Your family?" A pause. The recalibration was almost audible. "I wasn't aware." "No," Amara said simply. "You weren't." Si-Hyo-yeon's chin lifted slightly. The movement was small and involuntary, and it told Amara that the conversation had already gone differently than planned. The punchline had failed to materialize. The maid had arrived in $3 million of fashion history and was now standing in the ballroom making eye contact without apology, and Si-Hyo-yeon Han, who controlled every social dynamic she entered, did not know what to do with that. "I hope you're enjoying the evening," Si-Hyo-yeon said. "Very much," Amara said. Si-Hyo-yeon left. What happened next was not something Amara planned or anticipated or would have chosen. She had decided, privately, that she would stay exactly 2 hours, long enough to have been present, long enough to have looked Si-Hyo-yeon in the eye, long enough to carry herself through this room in her gray dance dress and leave with her dignity intact, and her point made without a single word that could be held against her. She was going to finish her water, thank the French conservator, and find her coat. She was walking toward the cloakroom when someone stepped backward from a nearby conversation, directly into her path. The collision was gentle, her water glass tipped. The contents went sideways, not onto the dress by some grace, but onto the sleeve of the man who had stepped into her. She started to apologize immediately. Then she looked up. Han Jaiwon was looking down at his sleeve with the expression of a man observing mildly interesting weather. He produced a folded cloth from his jacket, not a paper napkin, a real one, the kind people didn't carry anymore, and blotted the water with the same unhurried precision he seemed to apply to everything. "I'm so sorry," Amara said. Her voice came out even, which surprised her. "That was completely my fault." "It wasn't," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected. Quiet in the way that rooms get quiet, not absence of sound, but the presence of something that made other sounds recede. His English was precise, lightly accented, each word placed with care. He looked at her then. Up close, the photographs were even less accurate. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that didn't appear in formal portraits. Not from laughter, she thought, but from the sustained effort of watching everything very carefully for a very long time. His eyes were dark and completely still, and they moved over her face with the focused attention of someone reading important text. "You've been here before," he said. It wasn't a question. Amara felt something in her chest go carefully still. "I clean the estate, Saturday mornings." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, more like the satisfaction of a correct calculation confirmed. "That's why you move through the room differently." She hadn't expected that. Differently. "Everyone else is performing," he said. "You're navigating." The observation landed with such quiet accuracy that Amara had no immediate response. She was aware, distantly, that several people in their immediate vicinity had noticed this conversation and were working very hard to appear as though they hadn't. "Jaiwon." A man appeared at his elbow, broad-shouldered, watchful, the particular stillness of someone whose job was to monitor exits. He said something low in Korean. Jaiwon's attention didn't leave her face, but something in him sharpened almost imperceptibly. "Excuse me," he said to Amara. Then, after a pause that felt considered, "Don't leave yet." He walked away before she could respond. She should have left. She understood that clearly. She had accomplished what she came for. The evening had already exceeded every expectation she'd arrived with. The sensible thing, the safe thing, was to collect her coat and her dignity and return to her life. She stayed. She couldn't have explained it precisely. It wasn't the pull of curiosity, though that was present. It wasn't the instruction. She didn't take instructions from men she'd spoken to for 90 seconds, regardless of who they were. It was something in the word asterisk yet that held her. Not "don't leave" as a command. Don't leave yet as though leaving was a valid conclusion he simply wasn't ready for. She found a chair near the garden wall and sat. She watched the room. And she watched, without appearing to watch. The subtle reorganization happening at the far end of the ballroom. Jaiwon had moved into a smaller cluster near the private corridor, 4 men, unremarkable in appearance, the kind of unremarkable that was its own announcement. The broad-shouldered man flanked him. 2 others had positioned themselves at angles that covered the corridor entrance and the main door simultaneously. She had cleaned this house for 14 months. She knew what the private corridor led to. She knew what room was at the end of it. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, and her face turned toward the garden, and she felt, for the first time all evening, something that was not composure but its opposite. The particular alertness of a person who has just realized that the situation they are in is significantly larger than the one they arrived for. Something was happening in this house tonight. She had walked directly into the middle of it. The first sign was the music. Not that it stopped, it didn't. The quartet in the corner continued their careful performance, bow to string, note to note, the sound designed to fill silence and discourage genuine conversation. But somewhere around 10:15, the selection changed. Not dramatically. One piece ending, another beginning, the transition smooth enough that most people in the room wouldn't register it. Amara registered it because she had sat in this ballroom on her lunch breaks, and learned the playlist Mrs. Park approved for every formal event. The sequence never varied. This was not the approved sequence. She looked toward the quartet. The cellist's eyes were fixed on the sheet music with the rigid focus of someone who has been told to keep playing regardless of what they hear. Amara set down her glass. She looked toward the private corridor. The two men who had positioned themselves at its entrance were still there, still unremarkable, but the angle of their bodies had shifted by degrees, opening outward now, covering more of the room. Small adjustments. The kind that meant something had changed in whatever they were monitoring. Across the ballroom, Seoyeon was laughing at something. Bright, practiced, the laugh that appeared in society photographs. Either she didn't know, Amara thought, or she had been told to continue as normal. Both possibilities were uncomfortable. Amara looked for Jaewon. He was gone. Not stepped away, gone. The cluster of men near the private corridor had reduced to 2, and neither of them was him. She hadn't seen him leave. She had been watching without appearing to watch, and she had missed it, which meant he moved through spaces the way she did, without announcing himself, without creating the small atmospheric disturbance that most people generated without realizing. She was thinking about this when Mrs. Park sat down beside her. Amara turned, startled enough to show it. Mrs. Park looked exactly as she did on Saturday mornings, hair precise, expression neutral, the composure of a woman who had spent decades being the most informed person in every room and had learned to carry that information without visible weight. She was holding a glass of water she didn't appear to be drinking. "You look well," Mrs. Park said. "Thank you," Amara said carefully. "The dress," Mrs. Park glanced at it once. "Celestine Aukhafer. I saw it in an exhibition in Paris in 1994. I didn't know it still existed." Amara said nothing. "Mr. Han would like you to move to the East reception room," Mrs. Park said. In the same tone, she used to communicate that the third-floor bathroom needed regrouting. "Quietly and now, if you would." The East reception room. Amara knew it. Small off the main corridor, furnished with the kind of careful neutrality that meant it was used for conversations that required privacy and deniability in equal measure. She had cleaned it monthly. It smelled like cedar and old paper. "Why?" Amara said, not a question, a condition. Mrs. Park looked at her for the first time with something that might, in different lighting, have resembled respect. "Because what is currently happening in this house is not something you should be present for in an open room." Amara looked at the ballroom, the laughter, the champagne, the quartet playing the wrong music with rigid precision, and the East reception room is safer. Yes. He decided that. Yes. Amara sat with that for 3 seconds. A man she had spoken to for less than 2 minutes, in a house where she cleaned the floors, had noticed her and made a decision about her safety before she had made one herself. She should have found that alarming. She examined her reaction carefully, the way she examined most things, and found it was more complicated than alarm. She stood. "Thank you, Mrs. Park," she said. The East reception room was lit by a single lamp in the corner, the warm light pooling on the Persian rug she had vacuumed 31 times. The cedar smell was exactly as she remembered. She sat on the smaller of the 2 sofas and listened to the muffled sound of the gala continuing on the other side of the wall and thought, with some clarity, that she had made a series of decisions this evening that had compounded in ways she hadn't predicted. She had been there 12 minutes when the door opened. Jaewon entered the way he seemed to do everything, without preamble, without adjustment, as though the room had been expecting him and had arranged itself accordingly. He had removed his jacket. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the forearm with the kind of precision that suggested this was functional rather than casual. He carried nothing. He crossed to the chair across from her and sat, and looked at her with the same focused stillness she was beginning to understand was simply how he occupied space. "You stayed," he said. "You said not to leave yet." "Most people don't listen to me in rooms full of other powerful people. It creates complications." "I'm not a powerful person," Amara said. "That's a conclusion, not a fact," he said, "and it's premature." She looked at him steadily. "What's happening in this house tonight?" The question didn't appear to surprise him. He studied her face for a moment with that reading important text attention. Someone came to this event who wasn't invited, not through the front entrance. Through the service corridor, Amara said. Something sharpened in his expression. Yes. The one behind the east kitchen, not the main service hall. It has a lock that's been faulty since March. I reported it to Mrs. Park twice. She paused. It was never fixed. The quality of Jaiwon's stillness changed. It was a subtle thing, like a current shifting beneath still water. He looked at her with the full weight of his attention, and Amara understood in that moment why people in his world found him difficult to withstand. Not because of threat, because of presence. The sense that you were being understood faster than you were speaking. You know this house, he said. I told you, Saturday mornings, 14 months. What else do you know about that corridor? Amara thought carefully. Not about whether to answer, she had already decided that the information was more useful shared than withheld, but about precision. She had learned that precision was its own form of power. It connects to the utility basement, which has a secondary exit to the property's east perimeter. The perimeter wall there has a section that was repaired last autumn but not correctly. There's a gap, small but sufficient. Jaiwon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What is your name?" "You don't know it," she said, not accusatory, factual. "No," he said, and something in his voice acknowledged the weight of that without flinching from it. "I don't." "Amara," she said. He repeated it once, quietly, as though confirming the weight of it. Then he reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew his phone and said something in Korean, low and rapid, and she caught only the word for east and the word for wall before he lowered the phone. He looked at her again. "You should stay in this room." "You keep telling me what I should do," she said. "Yes," he said simply. "Tonight I'm probably right." She almost smiled. She didn't. "And tomorrow." His eyes held hers. Tomorrow is a different question. Outside the east reception room, somewhere in the house she had cleaned for 14 months, she heard the sound of something heavy falling. Then silence. Then the quartet, still playing, the wrong music in rigid determined strokes, pretending beautifully that everything was fine. Jaiwon did not move. He did not look toward the sound. He kept his eyes on her face with the deliberate calm of someone who has already deployed everything necessary and is now simply waiting for confirmation. "Are you afraid?" he asked. Amara considered the question with the honesty it deserved. "Not yet," she said. Something moved through his expression, brief, unguarded, gone before she could fully read it. But she thought, in the fraction of a second it lasted, that it looked almost like relief. The sound didn't repeat. That was almost worse. A single heavy impact, and then nothing, no voices, no footsteps, no cascade of consequence. Just the quartet on the other side of the wall performing their beautiful lie and the cedar and lamplight stillness of the east reception room, and Jaiwon sitting, across from her like a man who had made his calculations, and was content to wait for the arithmetic to resolve itself. Amara had worked in enough houses to know that silence after a sudden sound meant one of two things. Either the situation had been contained, or it was being contained, and the people doing the containing were professional enough to do it without noise. She looked at Jaiwon's face and revised her options to one. "How many men do you have in this house tonight?" she asked. He looked at her with something that might have been amusement in a different man. "Enough." "That's not a number." "No," he agreed, "it isn't." She let it go. She was constructing the evening's architecture in her mind, assembling what she knew and what she'd observed, and what she could reasonably infer. Someone had entered through the faulty service corridor lock. Someone who knew the layout well enough to use an entrance that wasn't on any public floor plan she'd ever seen. Someone who had come specifically tonight, to this event, when the house was full of people and chaos, and the kind of social noise that made precise movement difficult to track. "They knew about the corridor," she said. Jaiwon was quiet. "Not the main service hall. The secondary one, that's not on any layout. You'd have to know the house to know it existed." She paused. "Someone told them." The stillness in him deepened by a degree she felt rather than saw. "Yes. Someone in the household. That's what I'm currently determining." Amara sat with that. 14 months of Saturday mornings assembled themselves in her memory. Faces, patterns, small behavioral consistencies and inconsistencies that she had cataloged without meaning to because observation was simply how she moved through the world. Who used which entrance? Who lingered where they had no reason to linger? Who made calls in rooms they had no reason to be in? She thought about one name. She held it for a moment, examining it, turning it over. She was not a person who made accusations on instinct. She required the evidence to be sufficient before she committed to a position. She ran through what she knew, what she'd seen, what had registered without fully registering at the time. It was sufficient. "Mr. Han," she said. He looked at her directly. "Jaiwon." The correction was quiet and without elaboration, and she filed it away without reacting to it. "The man who manages your East Perimeter security rotation. I've seen him on my Saturday mornings. He doesn't work Saturdays. He has no reason to be here on Saturdays, but he walks that East Corridor consistently, always the same section, always checking something near the utility junction that doesn't need checking weekly." The silence that followed was a different quality than the ones before it. Jaiwon's face remained still, completely still, but something behind his eyes moved with rapid, precise intelligence, connecting, confirming, running its own calculation. She watched it happen and said nothing and let the information land at whatever depth it needed to reach. "His name," Jaiwon said. "I don't know his name. I know his face. Medium height, scar on the left side of his jaw. He wears his earpiece on the right even though most of your other security staff wear theirs on the left." Jaiwon picked up his phone, said 4 words in Korean, put it down. "You notice everything," he said, not admiringly, factually, the way he said most things. "I clean rooms that people think are empty," Amara said. "People behave differently in rooms they think are empty." "What do you notice about this room?" he said. "Right now." She understood the question wasn't about the room. She answered it honestly anyway. "That you're the calmest person I've met in a situation that isn't calm. That you haven't checked the door once since you sat down, which means you already know what's on the other side of it. That you're asking me questions you mostly already know the answers to." "Why would I do that?" "To see how I think," she said. "Not what I know, how I think." He looked at her for a long moment. "And what am I learning?" "That's your calculation to make," she said. "Not mine." At 10:52, the door opened and the broad-shouldered man entered. He spoke in Korean, low and rapid, his eyes moving to Amara and then back to Jaiwon with the professional neutrality of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by what he found his employer doing. Jaiwon listened without expression, asked one question, received an answer that was 3 words long. The broad-shouldered man left. Jaiwon stood. He moved to the window and looked out at the east garden, the same garden Amara had watched from the ballroom, the one she had left the door cracked open for, the cold air she had stood in to keep herself anchored. His back was to her, and she could see the line of his shoulders and the way he was processing something, arriving at a conclusion, allowing himself the 3 seconds of stillness required to make a decision cleanly before executing it. He turned. "The man with the scar," he said. "He's been detained." Amara felt something in her chest release that she hadn't been aware of holding, and the person he let in. "Also detained." A pause. "There were 2 of them." "Were they here for you?" He looked at her with the direct, unadorned honesty she was beginning to understand was simply his register. He didn't soften things or construct comfortable evasions. He spoke the truth the way he moved, precisely, without waste. "Yes." "At your own wife's event." "My wife's events have predictable guest lists and predictable layouts and predictable security rotations," he said. "They have been predictable for 11 years. Predictability is a vulnerability." "But you came this year." "Yes." "Why?" He crossed back toward the chair and stood beside it rather than sitting, and looked at her with that full-weight attention. 3 days ago, I received information that this event had been selected as an opportunity. I came back to manage it." "You let it proceed," Amara said slowly. "You let the whole gala continue, all those people in there." "We're never in danger," he said. "The people who came tonight came for me specifically. A crowded room is cover, not a target, and a crowded room correctly managed is also a trap." She absorbed that. The ballroom full of champagne and silk and carefully maintained social performance. She had been sitting inside a deliberately constructed trap and hadn't known it. The music, the guests, the lights. Mrs. Park knew, Amara said. Mrs. Park always knows, he said, with something in his voice that was the closest thing to warmth she'd heard from him. She has been with this family for 22 years. She came to get me specifically, Amara said. She didn't move anyone else out of the ballroom. No. You told her to move me. Yes. The word sat between them simply, without decoration. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the lamp in the corner threw its warm light across the Persian rug. She had vacuumed 31 times, and the cedar smell was steady, and the quartet had finally stopped playing on the other side of the wall. You'd spoken to me for 2 minutes, she said. I'd watched you for 40, he said. Amara was quiet. You walked into this house the way you owned it, he said. Not arrogance, familiarity, knowledge. You read every person in that room without appearing to look at them. You positioned yourself at the garden wall best sight line, closest exit, no one could approach from behind. You were the only person in a room full of powerful people who was actually paying attention. She had no response to that. In my world, he said quietly, that is not a small thing. Outside, she heard footsteps in the corridor, measured, controlled, the sound of things being resolved. The house settling back into itself. The threat neutralized, processed, filed into whatever category Jaiwan filed such things. She thought about the dress, about Celestine Ackhafer walking into rooms that weren't built for her, about her mother's voice telling her that starring was just looking with your mouth open, about the invitation that was meant to humiliate her and had instead delivered her to this room, this conversation, this man sitting across from her with his sleeves rolled to the forearm and his complete. Unhurried attention, resting on her face like it belonged there. She thought about the 14 months she had been invisible in this house. She thought about how comprehensively that had just ended. What happens now? She asked. Jaiwan looked toward the door, then back at her. His expression was still, but beneath it she could see the shape of a decision being made, not impulsively, not casually, but with the full weight of someone who understood that decisions made in moments like this one had consequences that extended far beyond the moment itself. Now, he said, I'd like to know who you are. Not what she did, not where she was from, not the biographical inventory that people used to locate strangers in their social taxonomies. Who you are. Amara looked at the man who ran half the city's shadows, who had come back 3 days early to walk into his own trap and dismantle it from the inside, who had watched her for 40 minutes at his wife's gala and decided, on the basis of how she positioned herself near a garden wall, that she was worth moving to safety. That's a long answer, she said. I have time, he said. And outside the east reception room of the Han estate, the gala wound down in its practiced, luminous way, and the guests filtered out into the cold night carrying their champagne and their gossip, and not one of them knew what had happened in the house around them, and Amara sat in the cedar-scented light and began, carefully and honestly, to answer. She talked for 20 minutes. Not about everything, she was not a person who surrendered everything at once, and he seemed to understand that without being told, the way he seemed to understand most things before they were articulated. She told him about her mother, about the scholarship, about the 4 years of rebuilding, about what it meant to clean a house like this one, not the labor of it, but the education of it. What you learned about people when you maintained the spaces they lived in without performance, without audience, without the careful social architecture they constructed for the world. He listened the way he did everything else, completely, without interruption, without the small performative gestures people used to signal their attention, the nodding, the sympathetic sounds, the interjections that were less about understanding and more about demonstrating that they were still present. He simply listened, and she felt heard in a way she hadn't felt in a long time, which was dangerous, and she knew it and kept talking anyway. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Celestine Ackhafer, he said finally, your great aunt. Yes. She understood that a room changes when you know how to enter it. She understood that rooms were built by people, Amara said. which means they can be entered by people, regardless of who did the building. Something moved through his expression, genuine, unguarded, there and then carefully contained. But she had seen it. She was beginning to understand that with this man, the things he didn't say were frequently more significant than the things he did. At 11:30, Mrs. Park knocked twice and opened the door and told Jaewon in Korean that the last guests were leaving, and that his presence in the entrance hall would be appropriate. He acknowledged this without standing, which told Amara that Mrs. Park had considerable latitude in what she considered a sufficient response from him. Mrs. Park looked at Amara for a moment. Then she said in English carefully, "Your coat is in the entrance hall when you're ready." A pause. "There is no rush." She left. Amara looked at Jaewon. "Your household manager just told me there's no rush." "Mrs. Park," he said, "has opinions." "Does she express them often?" "Never directly," he said, "which is how I know when she feels strongly." Amara almost smiled. "Didn't. What was her opinion just now?" "That you should stay a little longer," he said. He held her gaze steadily. "I share it." The directness of it landed without softening, and she sat with it and felt the weight of the evening pressing in around her. The dress, the ballroom, the faulty corridor lock, the 40 minutes he'd watched her before they spoke, the way he'd said "don't leave yet," as though leaving was simply not a conclusion he was willing to accept. "Your wife is in this house," Amara said. "Yes." "This is her event." "Yes." "And you're sitting in the East reception room, asking me to stay longer." He looked at her without evasion. "My marriage," he said, "has been a legal arrangement for 9 years. Seo-yeon understands this. She has always understood this. She married the position, not the man. That is not a complaint. It was a mutual architecture, and it has functioned as designed." He paused. "But it is not what you're asking about." "What am I asking about?" "Whether I'm a man who operates with integrity," he said. "Whether the situation you're in has boundaries you can trust." Amara held his gaze. "Is it?" "Yes," he said simply. "I don't pursue things I'm not prepared to be accountable for." She believed him. That was the unsettling part. She believed him not because she was naive or because the evening had been sufficiently cinematic to suspend her judgment, but because she had spent 14 months learning this house, and she had learned long ago that a person's private spaces told the truth that their public face curated. She had cleaned Jaewon's private study. She had seen his desk, ordered, precise, nothing performative about it. She had seen the books he actually read versus the ones displayed for visitors. She had seen the single photograph he kept in the drawer rather than on the surface. A woman she didn't recognize, older, something in the shape of his jaw repeated in hers. His mother, she thought, kept private because some things were not for the room to see. A man who understood the difference between what was displayed and what was kept. She understood that difference intimately. She stood at 11:47. Not because she wanted to leave. She examined that fact directly and honestly, as she examined most things, but because she knew the difference between a moment and a decision, and this needed to be a decision made in daylight, with full information, without the pressure of cedar lamplight and a man who watched her like she was the only thing in the room worth watching. He stood when she stood. Of course he did. "The dress needs to go back to its garment bag," she said. "And tomorrow?" The question again. She looked at him. "Tomorrow I have a Saturday morning." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Almost nothing. "The estate will need cleaning," he said. "There was a considerable event here tonight." "There was," she agreed. "I'll be here tomorrow," he said. "I don't return to Busan until Monday." She picked up her small bag from the cushion beside her. "Mr. Han." "Jaewon." She stopped, looked at him. He returned the look without apology, without performance, with the same quiet insistence he'd used the first time. Not a demand, a correction. The kind made by someone who had decided something and was simply waiting for the other party to catch up. "Jaewon," she said. He was still for a moment. Then he moved to the door and opened it for her, and she walked past him into the corridor. The main corridor, not the service one, the one with the wide floors and the paintings she had dusted for 14 months. And she felt the shift of the house around her, the gala's residue settling, the staff moving quietly through the aftermath. At the entrance hall, her coat was waiting, exactly as Mrs. Park had said. She put it on over the dress, $3 million of history disappearing under a practical wool coat, and she thought about Celestine, who had understood that what you carried beneath your coat was entirely your own business. The valet brought a car without being asked. She paused at the top of the entrance steps and turned. Jaiwan was standing in the entrance hall doorway. He hadn't followed her out. He was simply there, in the threshold, watching her leave the way he had watched her all evening, with the unhurried patience of a man who understood that the things worth waiting for required actual waiting. "Amara," he said. She turned fully. "The invitation," he said. "The one my wife sent you." A pause. "I'm glad you came." She looked at him standing in the doorway of the house she cleaned every Saturday morning. In the light that fell across the entrance hall, she had mopped 31 times, and she felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't had a name for in a very long time. "So am I," she said. She got into the car. She did not look back. She didn't need to. She could feel the weight of his attention on the back of her neck all the way down the long gravel drive, past the gates, past the security booth, out into the city that was still moving and breathing, and entirely unaware that anything had shifted tonight. But something had shifted. She knew it with the same certainty she knew floor plans and corridor layouts, and the difference between a lock that was broken and a lock that had been broken deliberately. She knew it the way she knew the house, intimately, practically, without romance or illusion. The dress was in her lap now, the coat open, the black fabric catching the passing streetlights. She ran one hand across it slowly. Celestine's dress, her mother's inheritance, her own now in every sense that mattered. She thought about what the evening had been designed to be. The joke. The punchline. The maid at the party, the awkward moment in the receiving line, Seoyeon's gracious performance of magnanimity, and the quiet satisfaction of condescension dressed as charity. She thought about what it had actually been. She almost smiled. She did this time. Outside, the city moved past in its amber and neon blur, and somewhere behind her the Han estate settled into its nighttime silence, and a man who feared nothing had stood in a doorway watching her leave like he was already calculating how long until Saturday morning. She had walked into that house as the help. She was leaving as something else entirely. She didn't have a word for it yet. She thought she'd have won by Saturday.